You know, imagine driving a car, right? But the dashboard is just completely blank.
Oh man, that sounds incredibly stressful.
Right. Like there's no speedometer, there's no fuel gauge, no check engine light at all. You just drive completely blind to what is happening under the hood until the car just suddenly sputters, shudders, and dies right there on the highway.
And at that point, I mean, you're stuck on the shoulder with absolutely no idea why it happened. Was it out of gas? Like, did the alternator fail? Did transmission just drop out?
Exactly.
It's a total mystery because, well, you had zero telemetry leading up to the failure.
Which brings us to today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are, as always, so thrilled to have you here with us because today we are looking at the journal of someone who, quite frankly, just refuses to drive blind.
Yeah, someone who has built what is essentially a server-level dashboard for their own everyday life.
Right. They are tracking everything from the exact minute their sleep fragments all the way to, specific programming languages they're using to code.
And what they discovered by doing this well, it might permanently change how you use AI.
Absolutely. So our source document today is a highly detailed, deeply personal journal entry. It's titled This Week in Review, 2026, Week 20, and it was written by an author named Ang, published on May 17th, 2026.
Yeah, and the mission of this deep dive, for you listening, is to really explore how meticulously tracking the seemingly mundane, ordinary details of life can actually provide a masterclass in intentional living.
We are going to unpack how you can avoid the trap of, de-skilling your own brain in the AI era, simply by changing how you learn and take notes.
It's a massive shift in perspective.
It really is. But let's start with the physical dashboard first, because Ang treats the human body like it's this complex IT system.
They really do. And the granularity of the tracking here it's what immediately stands out. Ang isn't just, jotting down, I felt tired today.
Right, none of that vague stuff.
Exactly. Ang is looking at the hard data. For instance, in this particular week, Ang records that their moving daily average for sleep dropped. It went from a solid 7 hours down to 6.1 hours.
And it isn't just the duration either, it is the quality of that sleep. Like, Ang notes that the sleep was fragmented into exactly 14 sessions over the course of 7 days.
Wow.
I know, right? That is an average of waking up twice a night, every single night. And Ang also tracks weight down to the absolute decimal. There was this marginal tick upward from 69.37 kilograms to 69.41 kilograms.
Which Ang directly correlates to a dietary shift they made. They note moving away from a 16.8 or like a 5.2 intermittent fasting regime.
Right. And just for anyone who hasn't tried those or isn't familiar, 16.8 means you fast for 16 hours a day and basically cram all your eating into this 8-hour window. And the 5.2 method is eating normally for 5 days and then heavily restricting calories for 2. So Ang is ditching those restrictive windows completely and moving to 3 solid meals a day, like a heavy breakfast, heavy lunch, light dinner with a very specific macro ratio of 1.2.2. That's plants to protein to carbs, or sometimes 2.2.1.
What's fascinating here is how Ang connects these seemingly disparate, almost, boring data points to find actual biological causality.
Yes.
Like Ang doesn't just say, I slept poorly and now my knee hurts. Ang actually identifies the exact physiological mechanism at play.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Ang is dealing with a relapsed knee injury, right? Experiencing this sporadic inflammation and pain. How on earth does waking up twice a night cause a knee to hurt?
Well, it comes down to the architecture of sleep itself. When you take short naps or have those highly fragmented sleep sessions, your brain just doesn't have the uninterrupted time it needs to drop into deep, slow-wave sleep, or REM sleep for that matter.
Okay.
And deep sleep is crucial. That's when your body releases cytokines, which are, proteins that basically help the immune system fight inflammation.
Oh, wow. So without that deep restorative sleep stage, the body simply cannot run its overnight physical recovery protocols.
Exactly.
The inflammation in the knee isn't being cleared out because the background process that usually keeps it in check, it was just continuously interrupted.
Precisely. And especially because Ang is also dealing with an underlying sickness this week. So the immune system is already heavily taxed.
It is exactly like reading server logs.
It really is.
Like, if a software developer's server crashes, they don't just look at the exact moment of the crash. They look at all the background processes running in the hours leading up to it. Ang is finding the root cause of a hardware crash, which is the knee pain.
Yeah, by seeing that the background processes of sleep and the circadian rhythm were just completely disrupted.
But here is where we really need to look at how Ang responds. Because, when you track data this closely, you can easily become a prisoner to it, right?
Totally. It can make you crazy.
Yeah, so Aang had this goal of 6,000 steps a day, but because of the sickness and these heavy downpours in the evenings, the step count plummeted to under 2,000.
Right.
I have to admit, if I were tracking my life this obsessively, seeing my step count fail that miserably, on top of being sick and my knee hurting, it would just make me feel incredibly guilty. I mean, isn't this level of tracking just exhausting?
Well, it would be if the goal was perfection. But that's the thing. Aang's goal is pragmatism. Aang doesn't throw their hands up and just quit for the week. Instead, Aang actively debugs the situation and adjusts the baseline.
Okay.
Aang decides, okay, on sick days, the new minimum step count is just 2,500.
Wait, why 2,500? Why not just say, I'm sick, I'm going to rest entirely?
Because Aang understands this really cool concept of metabolic momentum.
Yeah.
It isn't about hitting some arbitrary fitness goal so you look good on a chart. It is about keeping the engine turning over just enough so the battery doesn't completely die. Even if it means just walking to get food or doing quick grocery runs instead of, a formal workout. It is all about paying off biological debt before it compounds.
That is such a crucial mindset shift. And I mean, if the physical body is the hardware Aang is debugging, the mind is definitely the software.
Absolutely.
Because Aang applies the exact same rigorous maintenance to their cognitive health. In the journal, Aang discusses a daily habit of writing 3 posts, specifically focusing on a series called Notes on Haskell Programming.
Right. And Haskell is a highly complex functional programming language. Just to give some context for you listening, traditional programming is kind of like a recipe where you alter the ingredients as you go along.
Okay.
But functional programming is more like pure mathematics. You write functions that take an input and give an output without ever changing the underlying state of the data itself. It is super rigid, but incredibly stable once it works.
And Aang explicitly states that the manual process of writing these notes and figuring out how to refactor existing Haskell code is, and I quote, when deep learning happens. But I really have to push back here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because this journal was written in the year 2026. We are deep in the era of large language models and super advanced AI. I am putting myself in the shoes of a modern developer right now, and I have to ask, why on earth is Aang spending hours manually writing notes and struggling to refactor code?
It seems backwards, right?
Totally. You could literally paste that code into an AI, type refactor this for Haskell, and boom, you are done in 3 seconds. Are we just romanticizing the struggle here?
It's the most important question for literally any knowledge worker right now. Are we wasting time by not automating everything? But Aang addresses this head on with a really profound warning. Aang argues that overly relying on AI to do the thinking for you will eventually de-skill your knowledge.
De-skill. Meaning like you actually lose your architectural intuition. You forget how to build things from scratch because you haven't done it in so long.
Yes. Because biologically speaking, learning requires friction. When you struggle to refactor code manually, your brain is actually building and reinforcing myelin sheaths around neural pathways.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So when you hand the problem to an AI, you get the final result, sure, but you completely bypass the journey. You didn't build the mental pathways required to understand why the refactored code is better, or, more importantly, how to fix it when it inevitably breaks in the future.
So if you just use the AI to do the heavy lifting all the time, your brain essentially atrophies. You become like a manager of code rather than a creator of it.
Exactly. That is the de-skilling trap. And to prevent this cognitive atrophy, Aang's solution is to relegate the AI to the role of a mentor, or, a glorified search engine.
Right.
You consult it when you are stuck, you ask it to explain abstract concepts, but you physically write the notes and restructure the code yourself.
It is like using a calculator to check your complex math homework rather than using the calculator to just instantly print out the answers before you even try.
That's a perfect analogy. And Aang makes another vital point here. This deliberate friction isn't just about retaining your technical skills. It is about retaining your passion over decades.
Right.
If you outsource all the problem solving to an algorithm, you strip away the joy of discovery.
That is so counterintuitive, though. I mean, we are constantly sold this idea that making our jobs frictionless will somehow make us happier, but the effort is actually where the satisfaction comes from in the first place.
Remove the effort, and you remove the mastery. It's that simple.
Which brings us perfectly to the actual tools Aang is using to achieve that mastery. Because Aang isn't just theorizing about code in a vacuum. They are actively evaluating the ecosystems these languages live in. And there's a really fascinating tension in the journal between industrial pragmatism and coding ideals.
Yes. So Aang was actually supposed to be submitting daily pull requests to resolve dependency issues in Elixir, which is another programming language. But Aang admits getting completely sidetracked by dabbling in a language called OCaml.
Wait, I have to call this out. Isn't this just a classic developer procrastination trap? Like, ignoring the actual real work you need to ship so you can endlessly tweak your tools and play with shiny new languages?
Oh, it absolutely is a form of procrastination, no doubt about it. But what comes out of that procrastination is actually a major revelation about how we choose our tools.
Right, because Aang starts comparing OCaml to Haskell. And Aang humorously describes OCaml as a sea of let statements.
Which is a bit of an inside joke for programmers. In functional languages, you often bind variables using the word like let x equal 1, let y equal 2.
Right, right.
If a language relies too heavily on it, reading the code feels less like reading an elegant mathematical formula and more like reading a tedious, repetitive legal contract.
And Aang compares that to Haskell, which can be much prettier to read as long as you avoid what Aang calls the alphabet soup of point-free coding styles.
Yeah, so point-free coding is a way of writing functions where you don't explicitly name the arguments you are passing through. It is mathematically elegant to the person writing it in that moment, but to anyone else reading it later, it looks like alien hieroglyphs. It is literal alphabet soup.
Okay, so we have Haskell, which is theoretically beautiful, and OCaml, which can be visually clunky. But Aang points out that OCaml feels much more industrial, attributing this to the heavy backing of major corporate players.
And Aang drops a really brilliant piece of trivia here, actually. The original compiler for Rust, which is currently one of the most powerful and popular systems programming languages in the world, was actually written in OCaml.
Really? Wow, that gives OCaml some serious industrial pedigree. But here's where it gets really interesting. Aang realizes that while Haskell might win on pure syntax readability, OCaml is actually better for building practical console tools. Why? Because of the third-party supporting libraries.
This raises such an important question about how we evaluate tools in general. Aang is basically stating that while the core language features matter, the ecosystem surrounding the language matters significantly more.
You know, I like to think of it like spoken languages. Haskell is like this beautiful, poetic language, but you are speaking it alone on an isolated, deserted island.
Yeah.
Whereas OCaml might be a clunky, kind of ugly language, but you are speaking it in a bustling marketplace where you can actually buy the tires, the steering wheels, and the tools you need to build a car.
That is a great analogy.
Mm-hmm.
For systems programming, Aang argues that foundational things like handling a command line interface smoothly, they just shouldn't be an afterthought. You need solid standard libraries.
Right.
Though, Aang does lament that in OCaml it's often third-party libraries doing all the heavy lifting, and both languages suffer from fragmentation because of endless language extensions.
But the core insight remains, right? The ecosystem is what determines a tool's real-world value. Aang even suspects that Rust will ultimately win out over both of them in the long run, simply because Rust balances a powerful core language with a massive, highly supported ecosystem.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this realization about software ecosystems perfectly mirrors how Aang curates the physical world too.
Yes, the exact same analytical framework is applied to Aang's offline hobbies. It is all about how micro-ecosystems support each other. Like, Aang is breeding a pistogramma cichlid fish in these outdoor ponds. But they aren't just dumping fish in water.
Right.
They are actively adjusting the ponds and planning to introduce other species, like guppies, entirely dependent on how the local weather patterns shift.
It's a whole connected system. And look at the gardening aspect. Aang incorporates these 1 to 3 minute walking meditations while doing mundane chores, like raking leaves after meals.
Which is so smart.
Yeah, Aang explicitly notes finding significant fun in raking huge amounts of leaves because it is actively paired with mindfulness.
The physical chore supports the garden ecosystem, sure, but it also supports the mental health ecosystem, which loops right back to supporting the physical energy required to heal that knee injury we talked about earlier. Everything is completely connected.
Which brings us to the home improvement rule Aang instituted with their significant other, which is decluttering exactly 1 item per day.
Just 1 item a day. They are fighting the accumulation of what Aang calls hoarded items all these moons. It is the ultimate slow, steady optimization. But I have to say, my absolute favorite example of this ecosystem thinking applied to the real world is Aang's camera dilemma.
Oh, definitely. The photography conundrum is the perfect synthesis of literally everything we've talked about today.
So Aang is an avid photographer, normally doing 1 or 2 photo walks a week. But Aang's mobile phone has outdated OS support and desperately needs to be replaced. upgrading to the latest supported mobile OS comes with a massive leap in camera technology, specifically better macro photography and support for X-Pan resolution.
And for those who don't know, X-Pan refers to this classic Hasselblad camera that shot ultra-wide cinematic panoramic photos. Having that natively supported on a phone is a massive creative tool.
Right. So Aang has this phone upgrade on the horizon, but Aang also has a broken DSLR camera, a dedicated professional grade camera. The budget to fix the DSLR is now directly competing with the budget to upgrade the phone. This forces Aang to step back and ask a hard question. Is it even worth fixing a standalone DSLR anymore?
It is the Haskell versus OCaml debate,
Yeah.
just in a different font.
Wait, I see what you mean. The DSLR is Haskell.
Yes. The DSLR has the pure, theoretically better core functionality. It has the much larger sensor, the pure photographic experience, just like Haskell has the pure mathematical syntax. But it is an isolated island.
And the mobile phone is OCam, or maybe even Rust. It might not have the massive optical glass of the DSLR, but it is the ultimate ecosystem winner.
Exactly.
It has the OS updates, the macro lenses built in, the seamless sharing, the cloud backup, and the fact that it is literally always in your pocket.
The mobile phone just has the better standard libraries for modern life. Aang is constantly weighing the practical utility of a tool against the friction it creates. Does this tool live in an ecosystem that supports my life, or does it require me to do extra work just to use it?
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this deep dive right now? Why does the journal of a programmer from a random week in May 2026 actually matter to your life? I think it boils down to the absolute refusal to live on autopilot.
It is the refusal to let the dashboard go dark.
Whether you are tweaking your diet to a specific 1.2.2 macro ratio to fuel your physical recovery, or whether you are noticing your step count failing and consciously deciding to recalibrate your baseline to 2,500 steps to maintain metabolic momentum rather than just drowning in guilt,
Right.
whether it is scrutinizing the standard libraries of programming language or deciding to ditch a broken DSLR because your phone's ecosystem is simply better, it all comes back to intentionality.
And you don't have to be a software developer or breed cichlids in your backyard to apply this either. The lesson is vigilance. Aang actively debugs life.
Yeah.
When the knee hurts, Aang traces it back to the fragmented sleep logs. When coding starts to feel hollow or boring, Aang traces it back to the de-skilling effect of AI and purposefully injects manual friction back into the learning process to preserve the joy of mastery.
It is a phenomenal way to approach the daily grind. And it brings us to a final thought that we want to leave you with today. We've talked extensively about debugging and tracing the root causes of our daily friction.
So consider this. If you were to track your own life as meticulously as Aang did, if you were to build that server-level dashboard for your own routines for just one single week, what hidden inflammation might you discover running in the background?
Are your daily habits causing a physical inflammation that you just learned to live with? Or maybe it is a digital inflammation. Are you relying so heavily on AI or GPS or algorithms to do your thinking that you are slowly de-skilling your own mind? Or maybe it is environmental, like clutter in your workspace that you are ignoring, but that is secretly draining your focus one item at a time.
If you turn the dashboard lights back on, you might be surprised by which warning lights are blinking.
You really might.
It is definitely something to mull over on your own. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it inspired you to look a little closer at the data of your own life and maybe build a dashboard of your own. Until next time, take care of yourselves and keep debugging.